The longbow. This tall wooden bow, made famous by English archers, could send an arrow through armor at a distance that earlier bows simply could not reach. It stood nearly as tall as the man who drew it, and using it well took years of constant practice, since pulling the string back demanded real strength built up slowly over time. Archers trained from boyhood, and over a lifetime, the bone in their drawing arms would actually thicken to handle the strain. On the battlefield, a wall of these archers could release thousands of arrows in a matter of seconds, darkening the sky before the volley fell. At battles like Agincourt in 1415, masked longbowmen brought down armored French knights who had long believed themselves nearly untouchable. The lesson was hard to ignore. A force of ordinary trained men, properly equipped, could break the dominance of the wealthy mounted noble who had ruled the field for centuries. Gunpowder weapons. First developed in China and later carried westward along trade routes, these early firearms and explosive devices introduced a kind of force that human muscle could never match. The first versions were crude and often as dangerous to the user as to the enemy, but the idea behind them was unstoppable. A small amount of powder could release energy that no arm, no matter how strong, could ever produce. Their arrival meant that thick castle walls, once a near guarantee of safety, slowly began to lose their value. A single charge could do what 100 soldiers with battering rams could not. Over the following centuries, the technology spread and improved across the world, and armies were forced to rethink everything. The way cities were defended, the way soldiers were trained, and the way battles were fought in the open all began to change because of this single discovery. The cannon. Built to hurl heavy iron or stone projectiles with crushing impact, the cannon reshaped both siege warfare and combat at sea. Early models were enormous, difficult to move, and slow to reload, yet their effect on stone was undeniable. When the Ottomans brought massive guns against the walls of Constantinople in 1453, defenses that had held for nearly 1,000 years finally crumbled after weeks of bombardment. That moment sent a clear message across Europe, and rulers everywhere realized their proud fortresses were suddenly vulnerable. Engineers responded by designing lower, thicker, angled walls meant to absorb the shock of cannon fire. At sea, rows of guns lining the decks of warships turned them into floating platforms of firepower, able to shatter an enemy vessel from a distance. Because of all this, the towering fortifications of the medieval world quietly became relics of an older and gentler age of war. The musket. As a shoulder-fired gun that almost any recruit could learn to handle, the musket changed who was able to fight effectively. Unlike the longbow, it did not demand a lifetime of practice, and a new soldier could be taught the basics in a matter of weeks. This simple fact had enormous consequences. Large armies could now be raised, equipped, and sent into the field far more quickly than ever before, since skill no longer set a hard limit on numbers. The weapons themselves were slow to load and far from accurate, so soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder in tight lines and fired together in great volleys to make up for it. Discipline under fire became more important than individual marksmanship. This style of fighting defined European battlefields for generations, shaped how nations organized their forces, and turned warfare into a contest of numbers, training, and nerve. The rifle. By cutting spiral grooves inside the barrel, gunmakers gave the bullet a steady spin that made it fly straighter and far more accurately than a smooth musket ball ever could. The difference was dramatic. A soldier who once struggled to hit a target across a field could now strike an enemy at several times that distance with real confidence. As manufacturing improved and rifles became standard issue, the old way of fighting grew suddenly and horribly outdated. During conflicts like the American Civil War, soldiers still marched forward in the close, tightly packed formations of an earlier era, and they were cut down in staggering numbers by defenders they could barely see. The slaughter forced a painful rethinking of tactics. Commanders slowly came to understand that men now needed cover, spacing, and trenches, because in this new world, simply being visible on the battlefield often meant being killed. The machine gun. Capable of firing hundreds of rounds in a single minute, this weapon gave a mere handful of men the stopping power of an entire company of riflemen. A single well-placed gun could sweep an open field clean, and there was little flesh and bone could do against such a relentless stream of fire. Its effect was felt most brutally during the First World War, when wave after wave of attacking soldiers were mown down as they tried to cross the open ground between the trenches. The cost in lives was almost beyond comprehension. Because defense had suddenly become so much stronger than attack, the war settled into a long and grinding stalemate, with lines of trenches stretching for hundreds of miles across Europe. Neither side could break through without paying a terrible price. War had become something a determined defender could hold far more easily than any attacker could ever hope to break. The tank. Designed to roll over barbed wire and crawl across the shattered, muddy ground between the trenches, the tank offered a long-awaited answer to defenses that had stopped infantry cold. It was armored against bullets, armed with guns of its own, and able to keep moving through fire that would have destroyed any man on foot. For the first time, a single machine combined protection, firepower, and movement all together. The earliest tanks were slow, unreliable, and prone to breaking down, yet the idea behind them was sound and clearly powerful. First used in the Great War, the tank truly came into its own during the Second World War, when fast-moving armored columns swept across whole countries and overwhelmed defenders before they could react. This new style of warfare emphasized speed and surprise. In the end, the tank restored movement and momentum to a kind of fighting that had become frozen and stuck in place. The submarine. Hidden beneath the surface of the sea, the submarine could approach a target, strike without warning, and then slip away into the depths before any answer could reach it. This unseen threat changed naval strategy completely. Even the most powerful fleet in the world could be slowly worn down by an enemy it could rarely find and almost never see coming. The fear it created was as important as the damage it caused. German U-boats in both world wars showed how a relatively small and inexpensive force could choke the vital supply lines of entire nations, sinking the merchant ships that carried food, fuel, and weapons across the ocean. Defending against them required new technology, new tactics, and constant vigilance. Control of the sea was no longer simply a question of who could build the largest and most heavily armed ships to sail upon its surface: the aircraft. Once flight became practical in the early 20th century, the sky itself turned into a place where wars could be won or lost. At first, planes were used only to watch enemy movements from above and report what they saw. It did not take long for pilots to begin fighting one another for control of that view, and soon afterward to carry bombs to drop on targets far behind the front lines. The reach of war expanded enormously. Cities, factories, railways, and supply routes that had once felt safely distant from any battlefield were suddenly within striking range. A nation could now be attacked at its very heart without a single enemy soldier crossing its borders. This added an entirely new dimension to conflict, one measured in altitude as much as in territory, and it forced every military on Earth to learn to look upward as carefully as it looked ahead. The aircraft carrier. By turning a ship into a floating, moving airfield, the carrier extended the reach of air power across vast and otherwise empty stretches of ocean. Aircraft could now be launched and recovered thousands of miles from any friendly shore, carrying the fight to places no land-based plane could ever hope to reach. This changed the entire logic of naval warfare. Battles could be fought between fleets that never once came within sight of one another, with everything decided by the aircraft they sent into the sky. The great clashes of the Pacific during the Second World War, such as the Battle of Midway, made the new reality unmistakable. The carrier had replaced the heavily armored battleship as the true center of naval strength. The mighty guns of the old warships, however impressive, simply could not compete with planes that struck from over the horizon, turning distance itself into a weapon. The atomic bomb. Releasing the energy locked within the splitting of atoms, this single weapon held destructive force beyond anything humanity had ever created or even imagined. One bomb carried by one aircraft could erase a city in a brilliant flash and a roar of fire and wind. Its use against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 brought the Second World War to a sudden and shattering close, and it revealed a new and deeply frightening reality to the entire world. From that moment forward, the most powerful nations on Earth possessed the means to destroy one another in a matter of minutes. This terrible power reshaped the politics of the decades that followed. War between such nations now carried a risk so severe, so total, that simply avoiding it became one of the central goals of global affairs, and the shadow of the bomb hung over everything. The guided missile, able to adjust its own path in flight and steer itself toward a chosen target, the guided missile brought a level of precision that earlier weapons could only dream of. Instead of relying on a great volume of fire and the hope that something would land where it was meant to, militaries could now aim for a single building, vehicle, or installation from an enormous distance. Accuracy began to matter more than sheer quantity. This reshaped both attack and defense at the same time, as nations raced to build ever more capable missiles while also developing the radar and interceptor systems meant to shoot them down. The competition became a defining feature of modern military power. Over time, the measure of a strong arsenal shifted away from how much firepower a force could pour onto a target and toward how precisely and reliably it could place that power exactly where it intended. The armed drone. Flown by a remote operator or guided by its own onboard systems, the drone allowed military forces to watch and strike without ever placing a pilot in harm's way. It could climb into the sky and linger over a single area for many hours at a time, quietly gathering information and waiting before acting in an instant with sudden and precise force. This patient, watchful quality set it apart from earlier aircraft. It changed the nature of certain conflicts in a profound way, since the decision to launch a strike might now be made by someone sitting safely at a console thousands of miles from the target. That distance brought real military advantages, but it also raised difficult and lasting questions. People began to ask what it truly means to fight a war from behind a screen, far removed from the consequences, and where responsibility should finally rest.